The Ukrainian armed forces has recently begun to focus on its activities in the south of the country and on the fronts around the Crimean peninsula. In these regions, the Ukrainian Air Force often uses the drones they have developed to conduct offensive operations. In fact, Kiev has recently formed the drone army of the modern century, blockading the Crimean peninsula and the southern fronts of Ukraine. Russia currently does not have a solution proposal against Ukraine's drone army. That's why Crimea and its environs in particular have become a real hell. Thanks to Kiev's stunning drone army, Vladimir Putin has a face like thunder as a result of 5 days of consecutive attacks on Crimea. On the first day of the new year, the activities of Ukraine's drone army first surfaced in the Crimea Sevastopol city. The footage of the drone attack that took place in the city was recorded second by the residents of the region. In these images shared on social media, it is clear that the drone is on its way in Sevastopol's airspace. It is not known exactly which part of the city this UAV hit, but in Sevastopol, after these attacks, air defense systems were activated and security measures in the region were increased to the highest level. Russian officials on the peninsula claimed that they received the intelligence of this attack a few days ago. But according to Crimean officials, intelligence doesn't matter right now because the Russians have not yet found a measure that will prevent the attacks of the Ukrainian drone army. The only known detail about the drone attacks in Sevastopol is the opinion of the Crimean media that the Ukrainian drone army is not targeting civilian targets, but targeting the resources of the Russians in this peninsula. The armed forces of Ukraine carried out a large number of attacks in the past day. In other words, drone attacks on Engels in the Saratov region, airstrikes on the Belgorod and Bryansk regions are just some of them. All these events show that the Ukrainian armed forces have weapons capable of carrying out attacks at distances of at least 600 to 700 kilometers, which is a great danger for the Russians. Crimean officials also underlined that the Ukrainian army can target even military bases on Russian territory with their drones, suggesting that there may be major drone attacks on this peninsula in a very short time, indicating that the first days of the new year are particularly important. Officials in Crimea claim that they have even received the intelligence that Ukraine will launch a huge simultaneous drone attack on the Russian air bases and other military areas here at any moment, and every second after these shocking statements by the Crimean authorities, the prediction came true. The attacks of the Ukrainian drone army targeted Xi'an, Koi, Simferopol, and Yevpatoria, where the air bases of the Russian troops are located. Explosions occurred near the air bases of the Russian army. Also, residents of Crimea reported hearing very loud noises in the western coast and central regions of the peninsula. The first reports of explosions in Crimea were posted online around 2:15 p.m. It was also claimed that these reports came from the city of Xi'an. Later that same day at around 2:33 p.m., new reports emerged of loud explosions over Simferopol and Yevpatoria. Meanwhile, Ukrainian activist Mikhail Ivanov published a message pointing to the attack of unknown flying objects near the village of Vadim and Zonkui in the Simferopol region. Vardiisk is the village, located 15 kilometers from Simferopol and 50 kilometers from Yevpatoria. There is one of the air bases of the Russian army near the settlement, which is within the range of Ukraine's Su-24 bombers and Su-25 attack aircraft and, most importantly, Ukraine's Soviet Aerojet-powered unmanned aerial vehicles. The most critical of the drone attacks here was the one at Russian military air base near Zanko. According to preliminary data on the incident, the Ukrainian drone army targeted the Russian military air base in this region and caused extensive damage to the Russian military base with striking drone attacks. After the incident, the number of dead or wounded at the military base in Zonkva has not yet been released. But the Ukrainian armed forces, with its drone army, had for a long time bombarded the Crimea and now the Russian military air base in Xi'an. Koi after the attacks, a red alert was issued at the military base, the Zonkui Russian military base, where air defense systems do not stop for a second, is currently still in danger of possible Ukrainian drones. Some officials in this region reported that they received intelligence that the Ukrainian Air Force would continue its attacks on Charnko. While the tension of the war in Crimea continues to escalate, in the first minutes of the new year, the Ukrainian armed forces uses long-range missile systems as a support force in this peninsula, as well as the drone army. Yes, we are talking about the HIMARS, gods of war. We immediately move on to the news of the attack on the subject on the first day of 2023. The Ukrainian army started effective and sudden attacks on the Svatove and Kreminna line. The Ukrainian armed forces blew up the defenses on the Svatove and Kreminna lines one by one, with a large number of successful shots from the HIMARS, MLRS and Kirovka, located on the territory of the settlement, were again targeted 5 times by MLRS HIMARS at around 1:45 a.m. on January 1, 2023. However, at noon of the same day, the armed forces of Ukraine launched 6 more attacks with high-precision HIMARS missiles on the settlement. As a result, the number of casualties in Svatove where demolition also took place is not yet clear. According to experts, attacks on this line are very similar to attacks on the right bank of the Kherson region. Given the high accuracy of such weapons and the devastating effects of attacks, the armed forces of Ukraine is most likely trying to make a breakthrough in this area. Also on Monday, January 2nd, another loud explosion occurred in the central part of the temporarily occupied Sevastopol at around 9:45 p.m. local time. Loud noises similar to missiles were heard in the airspace in the central part of the city. After these sounds, another very striking explosion occurred. The sound of the explosion was so strong that almost all residents of Sevastopol heard it. The air defense systems in Sevastopol, where the incident took place, started to give warning signals. After this explosion, emergency response teams were dispatched to the area where the explosion took place. However, there are not many details about the incident at the moment. It is not known how many people were injured or killed, where exactly the area was damaged, and which missile or drone caused the attacks. Russian authorities prefer to keep the details of the incident as a secret, but some Russian officials claimed that the explosion in Sevastopol was an act of the Ukrainian armed forces, especially in the first days of 2023. The Ukraine-Russia war is moving towards a different dimension than ever before, thanks to Kiev's incredible drone army. While more ground operations, missile attacks, and artillery fire were at the forefront in the past month, the Ukrainian armed forces changed the rules of the game by establishing the drone army of the modern century. As time progressed, remote-controlled drones have provided effective victories on both sides of the war. To date, however, the Ukrainian army has dramatically improved the drones in its inventory, expanding the range of these vehicles and increasing their area of influence. The current primary goal of the Ukrainian Air Force, which added jet engines to Soviet air UAVs, is to take back the Crimea. As Zelensky emphasizes in every statement, as the leader of Ukraine mentioned, "We will see together whether the war that started in Crimea will end on this peninsula." The Russian commanders who put the Russian army in great stalemate with their unsuccessful strategies in the Ukrainian war are being removed from the army one by one by the order of Russian President Vladimir Putin. Let's examine the firing of dozens of Russian commanders and why they failed along with what's going on within the Russian military. Increasing Russian speculation about changes in Russian military command indicates that Russia may soon change its top military command due to the failed winter offensive. Russian mil bloggers claimed that the Russian Ministry of Defense recalled the commander of the Russian airborne forces, Colonel General Mikhail Zelensky, on the trail of the general, who was on leave after the Russian Ministry of Defense was reported to have replaced him with Lieutenant General Oleg Makarovich. The Russian MOD never confirmed Zelensky's dismissal and presumably put him on leave so that the MOD could recall him to command the Russian airborne forces when deemed necessary. Russian mil bloggers claimed that Zelensky immediately flew to the Russian Joint Group headquarters in Rostov-on-Don in Krasnodarkhy to take command of the Russian airborne forces and is already planning future operations. Another Russian mil blogger claimed that Colonel General Alexander Lapin, chief of the General Staff of the Land Forces and former commander of the Central Military District, flew with Teplitsky to the Joint Grouping headquarters. The Russian MOD has officially replaced Lapin with Lieutenant General Andrei Mordovtsev as CMD commander after Lapin faced intense public criticism for his command of the Svatove Kreminna line in the fall of 2022. However, it's still unclear whether Lapin will regain his role of commanding forces in Ukraine. Russian sources estimate that as of last week, the Russian Ministry of Defense recently dismissed the commander of the Eastern Military District, Colonel General Rustam Muratov, in response to intense criticism of his command for inflicting significant losses in offensive operations near Vuhledar in early 2023. Russian, Ukrainian, and Western sources observed that the Russian winter offensive failed to meet the Kremlin's goal of capturing the administrative borders of Donetsk and Luhansk regions. Russian Chief of Staff Valery Gerasimov announced that Russian forces are focusing most of their efforts on capturing Donetsk Oblast and that Russian forces have launched their winter offensive operation along the Kupiansk-Svatove and Kreminna line in early February. The UK Ministry of Defense observed that during Gerasimov's appointment as operational commander in Ukraine, Russia failed to expand its control over the Donbass and made only marginal gains by wasting mobilized personnel. Ukrainian intelligence officials, on the other hand, stated that Gerasimov missed the Kremlin's deadline to seize Donbass. So how successful can the stern offensive be when the command echelon of the Russian army is in this state? Russian mill bloggers were worried that Russian forces would have to finish their offensive operations in Bakhmut and Avdiivka to prepare for the Ukrainian counteroffensive, which they awaited between Orthodox Easter and Soviet Victory Day. Mill bloggers stressed their disappointment at the lack of decisive fighting over the winter and observed that Russia would not be able to continue a large-scale offensive operation if it failed to secure Bakhmut and Avdiivka in the coming weeks. Alexander Khodakovsky, deputy head of the main directorate of the Russian National Guard in the Russian-controlled Donetsk Oblast, agreed with the former commander of Ukrainian troops, General Sergei Surovikin, that Russia should move to defensive positions. Khodakovsky noted that the failures during the attack caused manpower losses and aroused negative feelings among the personnel, arguing that unnamed actors may be trying to continue the operation aggressive for personal reasons rather than taking a rational approach to the matter. Khodakovsky's comment implied that Gerasimov was self-interested in continuing the attack, possibly to win the favor of Russian President Vladimir Putin. The recent appointment of Khodakovsky as regional vice president of Rosgvardia and Surovikin's return to the information field, at least by proxy, may indicate that Gerasimov's failed offensive is already drawing Putin's attention. Khodakovsky and mill bloggers demands that Russian forces prioritize defensive operations are not unreasonable and show that nationalist groups are sensitive to changing dynamics on the front lines. The Russian winter offensive is unlikely to succeed given the persistent failure of the Russian command to grasp the time and space relations involved in such an operation. Russia lacks the combat power to sustain multiple major offensive operations in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions. The ongoing recruitment campaigns in Russia and Ukraine may indicate that Russia is preparing for a shortage of military reserves. In addition, the fact that Russia's losses have increased so much affects Russia's war power negatively. Images recently surfaced online showing a Russian tank commander. At the moment, a Russian tank was destroyed in Ukraine. The video shared on social media allegedly shows the attack on a Russian D-80V tank in the Luhansk region in eastern Ukraine from the active of the Moscow forces commander. In the video, the tank is shot down and part of the vehicle bounces back towards the camera's viewpoint, shot over the left shoulder of the apparently Russian tank commander. The surviving tank then turns upside down, revealing the fleeing soldiers from inside the tank. So what measures can Russia take to prevent its losses? The General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine said that Russia has lost a total of 3,619 tanks since February 2022, when the war began, according to some open sources. Since the start of the war, Russia has lost 1909 tanks captured by Ukrainian forces, of which 1156 destroyed and 553 captured. The numbers given by the sources include 277 Russian T-80 Versus of the type seen in the video you mentioned, but the actual number may be higher as these sources only recorded visually confirmed losses. Ukraine has repeatedly shared images of Russian tanks being destroyed. In late March, Ukraine's 36th Marine Brigade posted a video on various social media platforms showing Russian armored vehicles being taken out by Ukrainian weapons. In February, former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev said Moscow would increase production of modern battle tanks after NATO countries donated Western-made tanks to Kiev. In such a situation, it's clear that it's natural for Russia to increase the production of various weapons, including modern tanks. However, the supply of spare parts makes Russia very difficult in production. Russia lost up to half of its significant pre-war tank numbers in the first 9 months of the war. Russia has also pulled all the tanks, such as the T-54 and T-55, from long-term storage. This was a move to make up for significant armored vehicle losses. However, the Russian army may face higher casualty numbers due to its use of obsolete tanks in Ukraine. Using all tanks will increase Russia's tank losses, and it is not certain whether it will contribute to the war effort. The fact that the production of modern tanks is dependent on electronics and spare parts, especially from Western countries, and Russia's inability to import these parts due to economic sanctions also hits the tank production. Western sanctions will continue as long as Russia continues the Ukraine family war. Russia can also engage in the business of producing spare parts that cannot be supplied due to sanctions. But here too, the insufficient production capacity comes into play. Since the partial mobilization announced in the autumn affects Russia's factory workers in general, production capacity has dropped considerably, and the only way Russia can increase it at the moment may be to pull the mobilized soldiers from the front and put them back to work. Otherwise, it doesn't seem possible for Russia to increase its production capacity in the near future. Today, the biggest news is coming from the east. Here, in preparation for the imminent Ukrainian counteroffensive, Wagner forces started reinforcing their flanks and trying to expand the buffer zone between Ukrainians and their critical supply lines. They have concentrated almost a third of their forces in the northern flank and conducted more than 30 assaults per day. But Ukrainian forces hit them from the opposite end and started clearing the ground with their newly arrived JDAM bombs. Last time I told you that Russian forces increased the fire control over the retreat routes from Bakhmut, which caused a spike in Ukrainian losses of cars and armored vehicles. I also told you that there were strong indicators that the Ukrainians started to take measures to widen the corridor. The freshest report suggests that the Ukrainians managed to not only start taking measures but also achieve noticeable results. One of the most important events that happened here is that the Ukrainians established a pontoon bridge in Ramuva. As you remember, when Russians were rapidly advancing in this area, Ukrainians blew up the bridge to complicate the situation for the Russians in case Ukrainians would have been pushed away. The restoration of this bridge means that Ukrainians push the Russians far enough from Ramuva to start using the main highway that connects Bakhmut with the mainland. With more roads available to them, cutting supplies becomes exponentially more difficult. The first reason why Ukrainians managed to push Russians away is that Ukrainians have successfully entangled Russians in urban fighting. Today, a lot of sources confirmed that Russians started storming the ASM industrial area. This is the most fortified part of the town, comparable to the industrial area in Mariupol. It has a lot of workshops and tens of floors on the ground which require significant resources to control and assault. Given that Russians are not planning to force the river in the middle of the city, ASM is the most favorable place for the Ukrainians to give the next fight. The second reason why Ukrainians managed to push Russians from Hromov is that Russians temporarily shifted their focus to Dubovo-Vasilivka. For many days they have been trying to establish full control over this small village, but were unable to assume permanent presence because Ukrainians control too many checkpoints around this settlement and were constantly firing at them. That is why over the last 2 days, Wagner forces have been conducting more than 30 assaults per day only in this small area. It means that more than 35% of all fights around Bakhmut were taking place here. So it is not surprising that there are success here. Came at a cost to their operations somewhere else. At first glance, it seems surprising that Wagner forces decided to sacrifice their progress around Ramuva, where they deployed their most elite formations in an attempt to encircle Bakhmut. However, as you remember, Ukrainians have reportedly started preparing for a counteroffensive operation in this region, and one of the focal points of their plan is precisely the area around the Sloviansk Highway. A lot of Russian sources reported that one of the main axes of Ukrainian advance would go along this highway. And there are a lot of indicators that Ukrainians have gathered a noticeable amount of forces near Mankivka. With that in mind, we can see that Russians are trying to establish as big a buffer zone as possible in order to secure their flanks. But Ukrainians delivered a huge blow from a completely opposite side several days ago. A huge explosion was reported near Georgievka. Later, it was reported that Ukrainians tested their new highly destructive weapon on Russian positions. Today, DPR officials confirmed that Ukrainians started using JDAM bombs. JDAM bomb is a precise guided munition that is capable of striking targets up to 40 kilometers away. As you can see, one such bomb practically destroyed half of the Opolia. This means that 8 such bombs can completely clear the region and open Ukrainians the way into the highlands. And once the Ukrainians move their equipment here and establish full control over the high ground, Wagner forces will face an unprecedented threat. However, this view is not shared by NATO chief, who remains convinced that Bakhmut should fall within days. Other high-ranking military officials are saying that Ukrainians to step back from Bakhmut because it bears no strategic significance. So Ukrainians are just fighting for a useless city at the expense of their counteroffensive operation in the south. Ukrainian officials state that NATO does not fully understand the situation in Bakhmut and undervalues the reasons why Ukrainian commanders decided to focus on this region. The Institute for the Study of War cites with the Ukrainian side and evaluates that the battle for Bakhmut became a strategic effort because the Wagner forces started increasingly using their best troops in an attempt to finish the Bakhmut story. This means that Ukrainians can reduce the most capable Russian assault formations, which will favorably influence the coming counteroffensive. Such conflicts are detrimental for Ukrainians because of Western partners do not see that Ukrainians are making the right decisions. It may negatively affect the indispensable military aid. That is why Zelensky strained hard to explain why shifting focus to Bakhmut is a strategically sound effort. But it is also very common for news outlets to antagonize people with different views and amplify conflicts to make their stories more popular in order to make sure that this story was not made up.